Oh. All right, so welcome to Data Hub Tech Talks or Tool Talks. I'm Evan Williamson. I'm the digital infrastructure librarian, and I work down here on Thursdays usually. And so the Data Hub is now staffed Monday through Friday, 11 to 3. So there's Bruce Godfrey, who's the GIS librarian down here 2 days a week, and the data librarian, Jeremy Kenyon, is down here 2 days a week. And so we're just trying to make this into a space where people can come down and ask questions and share stuff at places like this talk. So totally feel free to stop in here anytime. We have a couple stations up here with all the GIS software on there. And we're always asking for suggestions if you have something that you'd like installed on these stations down here. If you want to have a class meeting or a consultation or something down here, this is kind of a cool space. So we've been having some classes in here where they're doing like small group work and want to plug in their computers and do some modeling and things like that. So totally welcome to use this space. Just get in touch with Jeremy and he can help you out with that. So today is a little tech talk about Markdown. And this is supposed to be pretty introductory. And so for a lot of you, it'll be kind of a review or maybe reinforcing some things that you already know, and then leading into being able to discuss some bigger questions in maybe 20 minutes. I have a little website outline that has a whole bunch of references and resources for you, and you can get to there by this little short link, which is is.gd/DataHub 2023. And actually, one more thing for on Zoom, if I could get you to sign in. I have a little sign-in sheet here. I'll put in the chat if I can find the chat. And I'm supposed to have a sign-in sheet for the in-person folks, but I don't. So sorry about that. So if you have questions on chat on Zoom, feel free to shout out to me. I'll try to listen to that or put it in the chat, and I'll try to check on the chat. And if you have questions in the room, just go ahead and say it. Why I want to talk about Markdown today is because it's actually really handy and useful, and it's really growing in popularity in a lot of academic contexts. And so I just wanted to give you, a lot of you probably already use Markdown on a regular basis, or some people do it without knowing it, realizing it, in things like R Markdown and Jupyter notebooks, adding your documentation right in the notebook, obviously. And so it's kind of nice sometimes to take a step back and kind of look at what this syntax really is and how you can use it for a lot of other things. So there's a lot of popularity right now with note-taking apps, and I get a lot of questions about Obsidian, which actually I don't use, and so we're hopefully maybe we'll have something about that eventually. But so there's a lot of people that are using it in a lot of different ways right now. So let's just take a look at what Markdown is and what it's all about. So Markdown is just a syntax to create formatted documents in plain text. It was originally developed by John Gruber and Aaron Swartz based on essentially how you just kind of write an email intuitively in plain text. And so it's supposed to be very human readable, but it can be converted easily into HTML for the web. And so the difference there is that when you go into your Word doc and you sort of, you start writing, and then you highlight this little section of a header, and then you just change the font, and then you make it bold, and then you make it font size 20. You're just adding visual style. You're not actually adding semantic markup to that document. And so that visual style looks just like what you're seeing here in this HTML. We naturally start writing documents with headers, with paragraphs, and there's some kind of visual style that's going to decide, that you can tell this is a paragraph and then this is a different paragraph because there's space between the two. Sometimes in your Word doc, maybe it's indentation that marks the paragraphs. And so there's visual styles that we kind of naturally connect with semantic meaning. And so on the web and in all the digital world, really, we communicate that with visual meaning, but it would be actually better if it's marked down, or it's actually marked with some kind of semantic tagging that will convey that meaning, and that way it'll allow it to be more useful structured data from our text. And so Markdown is a really easy way to be able to do that without having to write a whole bunch of pointy brackets around everything as you're writing. So Markdown files, ultimately, it's just plain text format. A text file is just the most basic file on your computer. They can really have any kind of extension, but usually you give the extension .md just to let you know that it's Markdown. You can edit it with any text editor, but there's lots of tools out there that people use. And obviously it's embedded as a standard, as a syntax into a lot of other kind of tools that are designed for writing other types of files. And so you can kind of think of the Markdown as a source code for your document that can be read and understood just by looking at it like a text file, but it's also, because it's structured, it can be compiled to generate outputs like HTML. You can convert it into a docx or a PDF. And because of this really simple kind of writing and the flexibility of it, there's a lot of websites that use it, note-taking apps, publishing systems, and code notebooks use it to format the content. And it's really good for being able to have kind of like cross-platform and writing your academic writing in a lighter, easier way that keeps you focused on writing the content rather than messing around with the fonts and things like that. So one of the really important things that a lot of people don't realize to keep in mind is that Markdown actually comes in flavors. It's not a standard like HTML or XML or something like that. It's really based on implementations that people have done. And so the original was pretty loose, and it was written in Perl, and John Gruber didn't really like specifically say a lot of the edge cases aren't like set down as a standard, which makes it hard for people to create interpreters that are consistent. And so John McFarlane, who created the application called Pandoc, tried to pull together a standardized version of it based on the original syntax, and that's called Common Mark. And so that's one that you see in a lot of different places. However, the Common Mark only covers a whole bunch of basic parts of Markdown that people use every day. And so a lot of people have extended it with all kinds of extensions. And that's just kind of important to remember when, if you're trying to write content that's easily transformable between a lot of platforms, the more complicated things you do, the less likely it's going to work other places. And so a lot of different, like Jupyter Notebooks, I think only supports a certain subset of it. It'll support everything in Common Mark, but it's not going to support a bunch of other things that some of the Markdown platforms provide for you. The most popular is GitHub flavored Markdown because you can use it everywhere on GitHub, and so then everybody's kind of adopted that as a common version. And there's a lot of other versions out there. For example, R Markdown is really kind of an extension of Markdown that mixes in blocks of R code that actually can be executed. And so it ends up being a lot, not just about the syntax, but about the implementation of that in the platform that you're using. And so the cool part about that is that it lets you use all kinds of different types of markup in your Markdown. And so you're writing your basic paragraphs and headers and things in Markdown, but then let's say you need to put a math equation. Most of the Markdown parsers will actually support LaTeX for your math. You can just put directly any HTML is technically acceptable part of Markdown. So if you have something that's more complicated that you want to like make sure that it's formatted correctly, you can just write it in HTML and paste it into your Markdown. And then a lot of people make it extensible with code blocks that can execute in different ways. And so again, it's just focusing on being able to write your content really efficiently without getting bogged down in like a bunch of formatting and that. So just I want to touch, back up at even another step and just talk about, so Markdown is a lightweight markup language, and so the idea of these there is more than Markdown out there. Probably the most popular in existence is Wikitext, which is used to write all of Wikipedia and all of the wikis out there. And the idea is to be able to, which I've kind of gone over now, is to be able to embed some semantic markup in a very simple way without having to write all the pointy brackets into your content. And the opportunities that are there for using those is just that they're stripped down, so there's only a set of things that you need to learn, so it's simple to learn. It's plain text, so that gives you a lot of possibilities in terms of it's just very shareable, it's very preservable, it's open source, and then you can still read it even if you can't render it. And it's also really good for version control. So if you're using Git, if you have everything in plain text, version control works properly. Whereas if it's a binary format or some proprietary format, it's not going to really be version controlled properly. The other opportunity there is separating, like I've kind of hinted at as well, is separating that semantics and content with the presentation of that content later on. And so a lot of times, you're working in Microsoft Word with a couple folks, and then you like paste something in, and all of a sudden all your formatting's messed up, and then you spend like an hour trying to get it back. And that kind of frustration doesn't happen if you're writing in plain text. You can do all that frustration later after you're done writing. And so you can separate those two steps of the process. And because it's actually going to be structured content, it's a lot more powerful. It's more useful because you can actually understand that these are headers. They're not just something with a bigger font. And if you write in this way, in a structured manner, your documents ultimately are more accessible for more people because the headers are actually semantically marked up. The paragraphs are semantically marked up rather than just visually styled. And then it's really flexible because you can publish it to the web, you can get it into ebooks, you can get it into blogs, you can create PDFs, code notebooks and stuff. And so those are all interchangeable in a whole lot of different formats. I just had an example in here that I wanted to share just to show this is something that I had from an earlier workshop. But here's a person that's writing a publication about how great Git is for reproducibility in science. And they write as a mixture of Markdown. So the main manuscript is actually written in Markdown. But then they've also written the list of figures in Markdown. And then they've, where is it here? Somewhere in there, they put the bibliography in the bib text format. And then they've used pandoc. You can see down here, here's their pandoc command to basically, they wrote some styles. They wrote the bibliography. They wrote the manuscript. And then it's pulling it all together into one document and exporting it as a PDF that they could submit for the article. So it's just kind of neat to be able to see that, just integrating that in your workflow, simplifying kind of how you're writing if you're making that part of your practice. So just to give you a quick idea of what it looks like, I have this visual demo. So you have some Markdown here, and then when it gets rendered, this is what it's going to look like in HTML. So the thing I wanted to point out here is I think is that it's really designed to be moving to HTML, which is this markup language where headings and things will be tagged. And so what you see is a heading 1, which in Microsoft Word or some other thing, we would just see this big, bold kind of heading that we understand is the most important start of the paper, will become in HTML a big, bold heading. And underneath, that's actually marked up with an H1, the text H1, but then we give it visual styles by using CSS in HTML or the default CSS in all of the platforms that you end up using. And then those can also be translated into styles for PDFs and other kind of outputs. And so you can see really quickly that it just is taking this really simple kind of markup and then converting it into much more complicated HTML markup. So you don't have to write all of the complicated markup when you're doing that. But it's still totally readable in this format. It looks basically kind of like you would write your emails, or you write your notes already in plain text. And so it's really pretty useful to do. So I kind of put together the basics here in a document. And if you want to, you can go over to this little editor and just do it right here in the browser. There's lots of different places that you could be working on Markdown, like just in your browser without installing anything. So there's like Dillinger is a Markdown editor that's just a client-side Markdown editor in your browser. It's really kind of handy because you can just start writing your Markdown and you get the preview of what it's going to look like, and then you can actually export it as HTML, Markdown, or PDF, so you can download it and use that. So there's lots of different ways you can just start practicing writing it. But the basics that I wanted to just run through really quick was just the basics that you would have for writing anything. And so headings in HTML are these structured titles and subtitles that go through your document that you kind of naturally write. You've seen this a million times in an academic paper. And the idea is that they're helping you structure your content and so that people can read it in an efficient manner. You want to do these heading levels. So 1 is the most important, 2 is the next level of importance, 3 is the next level of importance, and so on. And to make it most accessible for people who are reading and for people who are reading it without seeing the visual of it, the idea is that you actually want to keep those sequential. So you go 1, 2, 3, and then you can jump back to 1 or back to 2, but you don't want to go 1, 5, 3, 5, 3, because that makes it more difficult for people to navigate the structure of your document. So for accessibility, it's best if you actually keep them sequentially in order. You can do it like here. This is what the most common that people use right now is put a hash in front of the text that you want to be a heading. And then you always want to leave a blank space above and below. Most of the parsers will actually still make it into a heading, even if you don't have blank space above and below, but not all of them will. And so the spec isn't prescriptive. It doesn't say you can't do that, but it's likely that if you want it to be as cross-platform as possible, just leave the blank spaces or blank lines above and below every block element that you have. So there's a lot of things that you can do messily, but if you really want it to be kind of like transferable to lots of platforms, if you just take a little bit more care, it's a little bit easier to read as well if you actually leave those blank spaces or blank lines. There's another way to write headers actually that is kind of the more traditional old way of writing headers. And so if I clear this, you could also write heading 1, and then you can put lines underneath it like this. And that should actually also work. And then the second level is like this, but this just doesn't give you, it's really easy to read, but it doesn't give you as much, since there's only 1 and 2, it doesn't give you as much control over the headings. So by default, it's going to support, Markdown is supposed to support level 1 through 6, which is probably more than you need. Any paragraph is just any regular text on a line. If you want to make a break between different paragraphs, you just leave a blank space or a blank line in between them. It's going to join all of the text together into a paragraph. So you can see that this has got a bunch of line breaks in it, but no blank lines in between it. But in the end, in the display, those are all one paragraph. Now, the reason why you'd want to do that is if you're doing version control. Version control is always based on and also doing anything on the command line, and working with scripting languages in general, you're always working with a line at a time when you're working with plain text. So if you write a paragraph all together on a single line, so let's say you have 5 sentences and you put it all on one line, there's a lot less level of detail that you're going to get with your version control, and if you want to try to access that data, that text, using command line tools or when you're scripting languages. So if you're working by yourself or you're working with a group, a lot of times the best practice is actually to kind of keep it at 1 sentence per line or a certain number of characters per line, because that will give you that greater level of detail about like who did the changes on things, and it also makes it easier to kind of, oh, this sentence is really good, I want to move it to a different paragraph, and you just copy that one line rather than copying something inside a paragraph and moving it around. And so it's kind of just something to think about when you're writing. It's kind of an interesting little detail, but either way works perfectly fine. If you want lists, pretty intuitive. You just put a little dash, you put a space, and then you put the thing that's going to be the list item. And so this is where Markdown starts to get pretty. You need to make sure that you have that space, otherwise it's not a list. It's just going to be interpreted as a dash in front of something. But dash space and then something is a list. The same thing with ordered lists is that you have a number, a period, and a space is going to start an ordered list item. And if you can have any number you want, it'll reorder it in the correct numbers, but it has to be a number, it has to have a period, it has to have a space. And that's how that's what it's parsing to try to figure out that ordered list. So when you start writing a list, you can try to keep it in the correct order, but you can see here I've got 1, 2, 6, 1, but when it gets rendered, it's always going to reorder it in the correct number with the correct numbers. You can also do some indentation to create indented lists, and a lot of platforms where you have to-do lists will actually support this kind of pattern where you do dash space square bracket space square bracket space and then the thing, and then you put an X in the middle to say that it's completed. And so GitHub and lots of different, and most of the note-taking platforms will support that little way of writing a task list. And most of these, when you're on like a platform, if you're just writing this in your text editor, obviously, usually you kind of just do this by yourself, but most of the text editors and a lot of the platforms will kind of have an autocomplete. So you start writing the task list, and then that task list will get repeated until you press return, and then it goes back to a blank line. So you don't have to just write this out manually every time. Inline elements to do a italics emphasis. You do a single star, and then you close it by doing a single star to make it bold or strong, as they call it in HTML, 2 stars. And then if you want to do both bold and strong, or bold and emphasis, you want to switch out. You do 2 stars and then 1 underscore, or the other way around. And you can see that that ends up being there. So the idea there is we think of like italics as kind of like a font choice, but really it's a choice about adding a semantic meaning to a set of words on your page. And so emphasis is kind of is actually the semantic thing that you're applying to that set of words, or strong. It's like you're really saying someone should pay attention to this. So you're semantically telling people that, not just changing the color and boldness. And so yeah, you can go through the rest of these. The other one that's pretty useful is footnotes here. Code blocks are really helpful. And then tables are supported in a lot of more modern Markdown applications. It's kind of a pain to write them by yourself. So you probably would only write it if it's a very small table, but you can do that if you need to. And there's a lot of applications that will let you write the table in some sort of little visual editor and then just paste the source into there if you need to do that. And then finally, if you want to put some comments into your Markdown, you can use HTML comments, which look like that: a caret, exclamation point, dash, dash, your comment, and then dash, dash, exclamation point, closing that comment out. So those are all the kind of the basics, and that's going to be supported by almost everything, except for the tables are kind of extended, so that not everyone supports tables. And the idea is that it's just really simple to start writing that. And then you've already know everything about Markdown now, if you didn't already. And so you can just start doing it in all these different platforms that are using this same standard syntax, and then you can move that text between different platforms. So the resources that I want to bring up there, show out or call out to you folks was, CommonMark has some nice tutorials, the 60 seconds or the 10-minute version. The Markdown guide has one. And when you want to start writing, taking notes in using Markdown, the best tool is typically just your text editor on your machine. So personally, I just take all my notes in a plain text in a folder, writing in Markdown that I have on GitHub, version controlled. And so that way I can collaborate with myself on my notes across all my different computers, and that nothing gets lost, and I can merge all my various thoughts at different points in time back together. And it's just a very simple way to write it. And then I can visually see that Markdown rendered on GitHub, because if you go to the web interface, you're going to see that something like this README gets rendered on Markdown. And so a lot of times on GitHub, in groups where I collaborate will actually have a lot of documentation written in the Markdown in the repository, because then you can go ahead and just reference that Markdown on GitHub, and it's rendered there for people to be able to read it really easily. But it's also really easy for the group to maintain that documentation, not somewhere else, but just in this one repository. So that's a really good use case. The other use case is would be doing some academic writing in your Markdown. And a lot of times people write in LaTeX or in Microsoft Word, obviously. And I kind of explained why it would be a little bit easier to write than in Microsoft Word. But in LaTeX, it's a kind of a similar situation. Like there's a lot stiffer learning curve in LaTeX to writing out your whole doc. There's a little bit more work involved in the writing. And so a lot of people use Markdown as kind of a short step to that, and then just pull in the LaTeX where they need it for making like equations or doing the final PDF of the document that you're going to create. And so the tool for doing that is Pandoc, and I have a whole nother workshop talking about Pandoc, so you can go and actually check out the resources there about working with Pandoc. And then the one that's really growing for a lot of folks is note-taking in these tools like Obsidian, which are really kind of note-taking practice, really. They're tools that are set up to try to set up this whole organizational system where essentially doing kind of what I said I was doing manually, putting all your stuff in a version-controlled repository and just having a whole bunch of notes in Markdown. Except that they're building on some additional parts of that ecosystem that make it, if you follow the practice and follow the way, the kind of added benefits that you can add to your Markdown, which is essentially internal links to other documents. There's this whole ecosystem that can kind of enrich your note-taking and allow you to navigate and re-find all of your materials in a very efficient and powerful way. So that's kind of Markdown in just trying to like really take it a step back and look at the concepts and hopefully help you understand how it integrates with all the different tools that you might use. And I just wanted to get to that point and then turn it over and see what kind of discussions people had, what kind of questions, and see where we're at. But thanks for joining today. Yeah. I know. Any questions about the generals and the applications?
That was great. I'm excited to start using a little bit more Markdown in Jupyter notebooks.
All right.
Like this with the check marks. That's really cool. My question is about when you're trying to publish an article. And typically with LaTeX, they have you submit the final PDF once reviews are done and all that, and they also make you submit your tech file.
Mm-hmm.
So is that similar with Markdown? In that you have to kind of turn in that final Markdown file? Do they accept that, or would you have to kind of convert that Markdown into?
Yeah.
Like LaTeX?
Yeah, I think that totally depends on the publisher workflows, and a lot of those, it's the publisher and then the kind of field, and so a lot of the scientific and engineering journals accept LaTeX because there's going to be all this math, right? And so I haven't seen somebody say, "Oh yeah, just submit it in Markdown." There's actually one, but in humanities that I've done it with, but you can take that Markdown with Pandoc and turn it into LaTeX, which is probably the way to do it. And so when I've done it, I write in Markdown, and then I basically set up the template in LaTeX, and then I just convert it to LaTeX. Usually I'm submitting the PDF, but you could submit the LaTeX instead. So Pandoc is the tool that does that kind of thing for you, and it's very established in the academic use case. That would probably be what you would do. But I don't think anyone's just like, yeah, just submit the Markdown, except for a couple of humanities journals. But the more often use case is write in Markdown, export it into the Word docx, the Word document, which for some reason they require, using Pandoc, and then they give it to you, and then they write their track changes, and I'm like, I have no idea how to use this. And then I write it in Markdown again. So, but so yeah, I think the Pandoc is kind of this little weird academic writing infrastructure that's out there that is all about converting between those formats. I don't know if anyone else has experience using that. But yeah.
So is there any effort underway to kind of standardize Markdown? There's so many different flavors.
Yeah, it's mainly that common mark, which was it's supposed to be the standardized. They're trying to make it a standard, and essentially really just clarify those edge cases, like because the original says you can use star plus or dash to like make a list, or for adding emphasis, and so there's a bunch of weird edge cases about that, like how do you interpret these edge cases, and you want it to be standardized. And so that was what common mark was trying to do. And they have their own implementation. So the original one was like, a lot of it is really based in where they implemented it. And so the original was in Perl, and then things end up getting standardized by the implementation. And so then the other popular one was in PHP. And then one of the ones that's used in a lot of web use cases is in Ruby, and called Cramdown. And so there's certain things that Cramdown does that have now become kind of a standard. It's just because it was implemented that way. It's not necessarily that it was a standards group that came together and said, these are the things that we should support. Yeah, it's not really a standard. And so you kind of have to choose one and just go with that. But, Bruce. Bert, sorry. I have a B name there. It's in my tongue.
Are there already existing tools or also efforts underway to use Markdown to build presentations? Because one of the things I like about the Beamer, the tech version, is that like it redoes the structure for everything, and it can also keep your equations if you have them.
Yep.
But it's also a pain in the butt because it takes a long time to write, and so I love to do something that was in a Markdown style that you can just quickly have everything reformatted on a global level. Keep the capacity for what LaTeX has.
Yeah, there is the Pandoc has one of those built in. And again, it's just kind of like somebody sets up a syntax that like you just follow that. It's like slide, and then the headers like indicate which are the slides, and then that kind of thing. And so you've used Beamer, you said?
Beamer,
yeah. And so it's very similar to that, but and so there's not like a standard for those. It's just kind of like somebody's implemented some version of doing it, but there is one built into Pandoc, or there's a couple of formats built into Pandoc that do that. And so a lot of that tends to be just kind of like someone setting up a template that works, and then you follow that convention to make it happen. It's very similar to Beamer. So yeah, there's nothing, but there's a lot of things like Pandoc has it set up so that you can like write it in one format and then like convert it into Reveal.js and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of like transform, because you have it structured, you can transform it into something else using Pandoc. So that would be the kind of idea. But I can look, I can send you what I was thinking of. I can't think of the name right at the moment, but I'll show you that. Your other question was about sort of when you had like a cover doc that's required, that's in like a docx, but then you've written your content in Markdown or LaTeX, and then there's maybe a bibliography and something else, and then you have to put those all together in a single PDF. Is there a way to just like cleanly do that? I think is your question. And so that one kind of depends a lot, and it's not, there's not like just a clean way to do that. Usually Pandoc will do some of that, like combining different doc types and then into one output. But a lot of times there's the easiest way is actually the intermediary to like take what you've written, put it into docx, combine it with that other docx, and then output it as a PDF. That'll end up being cleaner a lot of times, but there is some ability to combine things using Pandoc. So we're going back to the Pandoc workshop eventually. We'll have to do that again, I guess.
If that's a quick follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So like the university has a lot of like Word docs, like provost website and class, for like internal funding, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like you get the Word document that has a template, that has a cover sheet, but like, I don't want to use Word. I'm doing it my own way. Are there any efforts underway to maybe convert some of those commonly used templates across the university into markup formats or Markdown formats? So those of us who use it could just actually like take the Markdown version and like help us skip.
Yeah, that would be nice. It probably won't happen because just because of university kind of bureaucracy. But we were trying to do that with the ETD format, the thesis formatting for the students. There was a couple essentially student-supported LaTeX templates for creating something that would validate using their that they require the required submission, and so it's totally doable, especially with LaTeX. And then with Pandoc, you could go between Markdown into LaTeX. But yeah, it's just I don't think that the university is like super interested in facilitating in that way because it's just hard in their kind of situation, I guess. But it's something that maybe the Data Hub could we could work together and make some. Here's our shared templates that replace a great one would be the university CV, because it would be so much nicer to just have that all as a data and then be able to just constantly update that, as opposed to trying to work on a doc file, which is it's just like outrageous. But so yeah, maybe that would be a fun thing for people to collaborate on and think about.
These orders, that would be great first step.
Yeah. What we really like in a library is sort of information management, research information management, and be able to give you some of that data from our systems so that you can just get your CV updated automatically by looking at your ORC IDs and things like that, which would be really slick, but it'll take a while to do that. But yeah, that'd be cool. Somebody had a question. Can you talk about experience with using different tools for different use cases, what the trade-offs are common amongst different types of editors? And so, like I said, personally, I write a lot of Markdown just into other projects that I'm working on. And so it's not like I'm choosing a Markdown editor. I'm just using my text editor. And so generally, I'm just using a text editor all the time for my own kind of practice. A lot of those note-taking apps like Obsidian are really cool, but it's another app open on your desktop for taking notes. So in a lot of ways that might be good because you have this, I'm specifically taking notes here as opposed to all over the place, and keeping you organized in that way. So if you can get into that practice, and there's a long history of setting up note-taking practice and trying to make connections between your notes so that you're building a knowledge garden for yourself. And Zettelkasten is like a note-taking practice that's has a long history. So, and it goes back to actual card catalog files, and people would take notes on cards in a very specific format that would allow you to cross-reference your own notes. And so now we can do that in the digital world in a much easier way, and also make it really useful for to-do lists and things like that. So if you get into that practice, it can be really great. Obviously, there's a lot of tool ecosystems built into, say, Office 365 that you could use as an alternative. But in a lot of ways, those tools end up being unconnected to maybe your research notes. And so if you can really work on kind of combining all these into one places, it can be really valuable to build up this garden of all of your personal research information and thoughts and notes. But again, it's sort of a practice that you have to build up. Yeah. Anyone do any of those note-taking apps or Obsidian or something like that? Anyone write a lot of Markdown for anything or LaTeX?
I've done a lot of writing in LaTeX.
LaTeX.
It was that one tool that you showed. It was the first thing you clicked on was pretty cool because it looked just like Overleaf, which is where you have your text on the one side and then the compiled on the other. So that was pretty slick for figuring out Markdown.
So for those online, he's mentioning Overleaf is a LaTeX collaboration platform where you can write your LaTeX and you have a preview of it happening, and then you can also share it out and collaborate with different collaborators. And Overleaf also will let you submit directly from Overleaf to a few scientific journals, which is kind of cool. And they'll have a lot of the templates available. So that's kind of a neat ecosystem as well. All right, well, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. So I'm trying to brainstorm ways that I might use Markdown in addition to like note taking, which I think is a great idea. But is there a page break tag? Is there a way to designate that?
Interesting. Yeah. There isn't in Markdown itself, just like HTML. And so one of the really interesting things that's coming up that I'm actually interested in working on is there's supposed to be in the CSS standard, which is the style sheets for HTML. There's supposed to be a new module of that standard that's called paged document standard or something like that. And so the idea is to introduce those types of styles into HTML, so that you could put a div or whatever and say this is where it has to break, or it should break after these page or after these images or something like that, or after this header there should always be a page break, or before that header. And so there's little rules that you can add in there, and so it would be able to implement things that are very similar to like an EPUB, the kind of logic that goes into the EPUB, but you'll implement it by actually adding these kind of styles to it. And so there's actually a couple libraries that already implement this. They call it a polyfill. They're like saying, we're going to start supporting this even though the browsers don't support it yet. And so one is called Page.js, and you can use it to make really great print outputs from HTML. And so it's really a great way to write. And there's a couple platforms that use it right now, and they create a beautiful website. And then it also just has the print style that's kind of built into it using this Page.js, and that you can create a PDF directly from the print dialog of your browser. And it's not just a crummy PDF, it's like an actual beautiful laid out PDF that's ready for print. So it's really, that's a really cool possibility as we kind of use HTML more and more as kind of like an interchange user experience, like format, or I don't know if you want to say format, but because I mean, you're looking at like so many of your apps that are on your computer right now are HTML. They're all really Chrome browser packaged with a UI on top of it. And so Slack and a lot of almost all the editors out there, and just lots of the apps, all these note-taking apps are all really a packaged browser with a UX on top of it. And so you have all of this content that's actually in HTML. And so if you can add those kind of extensions to make beautiful print outputs, it's pretty cool.
So a related question, is there something akin to like an anchor so that you go to the table of contents?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's already, you can already do that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. That's
definitely a great answer. Yeah, so I can show you that at some point. Okay, it's cool. Yeah, so thank you for joining us. We'll be here next week for, I think we have something next week, but you can check the library's website for workshops, where we're usually here on this time and date, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Online.
What's the syntax for?
Here,